I've had a really interesting comment back about. So I left a comment about somebody who'd raised the issue of Farage and dismissed the allegation of his racist songs, and talked about bawdy songs from 50 years ago. Well, I don't think Farage's songs were bawdy, and that was the point of my previous post. But the Feckle Puny has written, the only thing I take issue with here, Tim, is where you mentioned the black and white minstrels. It was a throwaway comment, and maybe I didn't think about it as much as I should have done. Some may argue they were not racist, similarly to how the gollywog is defended. However, one has to examine the history of minstrels and indeed blackface, where white performers would black up and often caricature black people with the usual stereotypes of being backward, slow, lazy, overly superstitious and childlike. The only saving grace was that they sang well. Minstrel shows were also born in an era where white performers could mimic black people in the worst possible ways. However, a black artist would never be allowed to portray their own ethnicity on stage in their own right. Now, in the 1960s and 1970s, on the BBC, there was a long-running TV show called The Black and White Minstrels. And indeed, there were black performers who performed in that show. And what the Feckle Puny says is a very good starting point. It takes us to the heart of the problem, if not the whole problem. Minstrelsy is not just a musical style, it's a structured representation in which white performers appropriate black culture, exaggerate aspects of this, including the voices, and then sell that caricature back to white audiences as if it were authentic. In the United States, this structure was born in a slave society and then sustained segregation. In Britain, it arrived with a different social context, but it did not somehow shed its racial logic at Dover, whatever the social historians try to say. And however much people claim that, we didn't know it was racist. In the US, minstrel shows emerged in the 1930s and 1940s. Thomas D. Rice's Jim Crow routine is a classic early example, a white performer in burnt cork, broken dialect, and grotesque movement, turning enslaved African Americans into comic stock types. The key stereotypes are exactly the ones Feckle Puny lists: lazy, childish, superstitious, sexually undisciplined, intellectually limited. Minstrelsy takes spirituals, work songs and dance forms created by enslaved people, cleans them up for white ears, strips out the politics, and then uses the result to reassure the same white audience that black people are naturally suited to subordination. It is racism made into an art form, complete with catchy tunes. Crucially, as Feckle Puny says, black people could not represent themselves. That changed in the black and white minstrels, but for the most part, a black musician might, actually, it's not entirely true. Dawn French's husband was a comic in the black and white minstrels, and he was very much himself. But the permission to appear in public as black was mediated through this white invention of blackness. One has to remember that. This is why minstrelsy is structurally racist, even when Lenny Henry, that's his name, even when the lyrics are sentimental or apparently apolitical. The whole frame says you will see black people through our joke version of them. Now the British story, the picture is more nuanced and more entangled with other traditions. Britain has its own history of blacked up performance. Mummers, some forms of Morris dancing still continue this, and local customs that use soot or masks as a general marker of otherness or misrule. And those practices did not originate in chattel slavery, and some of them long predate Atlantic slavery altogether. But from the mid-19th century, that older tradition fuses with imported American minstrelsy. And Christie's minstrels and other US troops who play London and the provinces in the 1850s. These British groups imitate them, then St James's Hall becomes a minstrel centre and so on. Blackface is no longer just a generic mask. It is now explicitly coded as something which does plantation melodies, and as several historians point out, minstrelsy becomes a way for an imperial society to enjoy a fantasy of racial superiority, the jolly childlike black figure who conforms to a type and confirms the civilizing mission of empire. So the British minstrels didn't grow out of the same plantation world as the US, but they are not an innocent cousin either. They are a cousin raised on empire rather than on slavery at home, who nonetheless absorb the American racial template, happily use it, even if they don't fully recognize all its origins and implications. With that in mind, the George Mitchell's minstrels and the black and white minstrel show, George Innes at the BBC and George Mitchell as musical director create this one-off television minstrels special in 1957, which then becomes the Saturday night juggernaut from 1958. Male singers in blackface, the television toppers as dancers, a mix of old-time plantation songs, music hall material and show tunes. Soloists like Di Francis, John Bolter, Tony Mercer become household names, and the associated albums top the UK charts. And in 1962, Robert Luff launches the stage version at the Victoria Palace Theatre, where it runs for about a decade and racks up more than 6,000 performances, a record run for a music show. Mitchell's minstrels are everywhere: London's West End, touring companies at seaside resorts, albums such as On Stage and the George Mitchell Minstrels, and On Tour with the George Mitchell Minstrels, sitting in respectable suburban record collections. Later, a young Lenny Henry, the man who would become Dawn French's husband and then ex-husband, joins the cast as a teenage black performer, and he's since spoken very movingly about how appearing in a blackface minstrel format as a black teenager hungry for work sent him into what he called a wormhole of depression. So what is the racism here? It's not that every viewer who tuned in at 7:30 on a Saturday night secretly longed for apartheid. Many families did experience it as just songs and frocks and tap dancing. Intentions varied, but the form itself still rests on racial hierarchy. White performers, blacked up, are presenting a sanitized and sentimentalized version of this slavery in an era when black British people are struggling for housing, jobs and political equality. The BBC's own archives show that from the early 1960s, black Britons and their allies were saying very clearly, this hurts, this is insulting, it trivializes a history of oppression. Campaigners from CRD Card, black readers of Flamingo magazine, internal critics such as Barry Thorne, all warned the corporation that the show was a disgrace and an insult. The response from the BBC, from senior BBC figures, is painfully telling. Some insist that the show is traditional, that it's harmless family entertainment, and that any racial meaning has somehow evaporated. One senior manager even suggests that black people should, for their own good, for heaven's sake, shut up about it. That is the logic of power, deciding that because it didn't intend offence, there is no offence. Now, that's why I would single the black and white minstrels out as from the television diet of things like Love Thy Neighbour and so on, which were ostensibly and intentionally racist. And it brings me to this important line. Racism, so much as, like so much bigotry, must ultimately be judged, however, from the perspective of those on the receiving end, not from the self-exculpatory intentions of the perpetrators. Intent matters for how we treat individuals morally and legally, but impact matters for how we evaluate practice. And the black and white minstrel show is a textbook example. For years, the BBC argued that it was not about race, only about tradition, yet the visual grammar is entirely racial. And in fact, the BBC was concerned enough to have one season, when it didn't use blackface at all. But for the most part, it was blacked up faces, white teeth, plantation imagery, cheerful singing set alongside the experience of black viewers who felt humiliated, stereotyped, excluded, and the balance surely shifts. Bill Cotton, who eventually cancelled the show, later acknowledged that what persuaded him was quite simple. It's all very well people who are not black saying, I don't think about it that way. It's the people who are black whose views you have to listen to. So the person who left the comment also mentioned the gollywog. I think the analogy is apt. Many white Britons of a certain age insist that gollies were simply childhood toys with no malice intended, that they were on the marmalade jar. Yet that figure, and they were in, what was it, Noddy. Yet the figure's origins, again, lie in minstrel imagery and racialized caricature. When black Britons say this image tells white children that we are comical, inferior, and ridiculous, the respectable response is not to explain their feelings away, but to re-examine the image. And that brings me to Farage and David Coburn's joke about confusing Humza Yusuf with Abu Hamza. And I was sort of involved in the end of that story. The rhetorical pattern is exactly the same. A racist move is defended as banter by Farage. It is just a joke. If the target protests, they're told to lighten up. Can't you take a joke? It's literally what was said. But from the victim's point of view, the message is brutal. You, a Scottish Muslim politician, are interchangeable with a notorious terrorist purely because your name and background sounds other. The distance between that and 19th century minstrels jeering at the lazy slaves is not so great, is it? In both cases, a minority is reduced to a caricature for the amusement of the majority, and the majority insists it's right to find it funny. So how do we handle the historical nuance that needs to be preserved? Now, I would put it like this. First, we need to recognise that British minstrelsy did have a complex genealogy, including older folk traditions of masking and mumming, and that individual performers and viewers did not experience themselves subjectively as racist. The George Mitchell minstrels were for many people simply part of the wallpaper of the 1960s and 1970s family life, as uncontroversial as a Sunday roast. However, secondly, one should refuse, I think, to treat that subjective experience as the final court of appeal. Because when we listen to black voices from Frederick Douglass in the 1850s through Flamingo readers in the 1960s to David Howard and David Oligosa today, a different story emerges. Minstrelsy is not just a song style, it's a long-running visual code that normalizes white supremacy and invites black people into the public sphere only as jesters or as echoes of themselves. Third point. We can therefore say something like this, I think. In the 1960s and 70s, the black and white minstrels were not experienced by most white viewers as consciously malicious, but the form itself was still racist in structure and effect. And black people were telling us so at the time. Our duty now is not to hurl retrospective moral thunderbolts at every pensioner who once tapped their feet to Dixie, but to be honest about what the format was doing and to apply that honesty to contemporary debates about just a joke. To borrow Feco Pooney's framing, the saving grace of the minstrels is that many of the performers genuinely did sing well. Well, that's true. The tragedy is that their talent was harnessed to a tradition that made black humanity into a costume. That it took place at a time when there were other instances on television of quite genuine and perverse humour based on racism, I think makes it makes it an interesting point of discussion. I think it comes from a different aspect of the racist trope, but I think it is one that needs to be called out, and the comment is right. Feco Pooney is absolutely right to take issue with that. I did qualify it in the previous talk, but I think perhaps not as much as I should have done, for which apologies.